Welcome everyone to our next to the last lecture in our series on cities and civilizations from the Princeton Adult School. I'm Dr. Mark Brannon. I'm standing in tonight for Deborah Capel, who's unable to be the introducer. Next week, our very last lecture will be here in Friend Auditorium and will be given by Alan Howard, titled Freetown, Sierra Leone, an African and Atlantic History. And you might ask, why did our committee decide on this particular topic? Well, we were very interested in having a city of Africa as one of the cities to be discussed. And Professor Howard is especially involved and interested in this topic. And he's apparently written extensively about Sierra Leone and has a tremendous amount of importance in the Atlantic slave trade, as well as importance in the recent years as well. So please come. We're looking forward to hearing about Freetown next week. Well, I hope you all have enjoyed this series as much as I have. It's been a wonderful series. And I have to admit, though, that I personally have never been to Mexico City, but I'm interested in finding out in here, by a show of hands, how many of you have actually been to Mexico City? Well, you've got a lot of people with some experience there. Okay.
An excellent audience.
Yeah. Well, tonight we're going to hear about
discerning audience.
Yeah. We're going to hear about the biggest city in the world, Mexico City, or at least one of the very biggest cities in the world. Tonight's presenter is Patricia Fernandez-Kelly, standing right next to me. Dr. Fernandez-Kelly received her first PhD in 1975 in art history cum laude from the Universidad Iberoamericana, more or less, excuse me if I don't speak it correctly, in Mexico City. She went on to receive a Master's of Philosophy in Social Anthropology in 1978 from Rutgers University, and her second PhD, this one in 1981, also in Social Anthropology with distinction from Rutgers. She's taught in Mexico and in the United States, including UC San Diego and Johns Hopkins. And 10 years ago, in 1997, she became a lecturer here in Princeton. And in 2002, a senior lecturer in Princeton's Department of Sociology. She is also a faculty associate in the Office of Population Research. She's an internationally recognized expert in international development. She has written extensively in the fields of immigration, women in the labor force, global economic change, and industrial restructuring. Tonight's topic, appropriately, is titled The Biggest City in the World, Mexico City. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Patricia Fernandez-Kelly.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Because I do believe that I want to stand here for a little while, and then later perhaps I'll use the portable microphone in order to field your questions. I'm very grateful to Mark Brandon and Sally Brandon for their gracious hospitality. I received the invitation from Deborah Capel, who is a personal friend and is married to one of my dearest colleagues, Miguel Angel Centeno, in the Department of Sociology. So of course I couldn't refuse the invitation, and I am very happy that I accepted, because looking into this room, I see a wonderful group of people, a discerning audience, and I believe people who probably know a lot more than I do, and so it's a great privilege, indeed an honor, to be in your company. The title of this presentation was invented by Deborah herself, Mexico, the Biggest City, and I have to confess to you that I am not an expert on Mexico City. I am so glad that, and by that I mean that that's not where I have conducted my research. And because I do empirical research, I actually prefer to deliver presentations about things that I am actually familiar with on the basis of investigation, and that would be at present the informal economy, second-generation immigrants in the United States, the North American Free Trade Agreement, etc. All subjects that I think I'm going to bring to your attention somehow. Before I begin my, please understand that I need to know something about Mexico City, because that's where I lived for the first 25 years of my life. And in fact, by then I had taught at the Universidad Autónoma de Mexico, at Mexico's National University, for about 5 years. Yes, I had no life. And in fact, that is still the case. Before I begin my presentation, however, I would really like to draw you, one of the things that I do in the Department of Sociology is that I am part of a little organization, indeed a tiny organization called the Center for Migration and Development. We at Princeton have many centers. The centers are really packages of information, resources, and ideas. I love the Center for Migration and Development, and one of the things that we do is that we organize colloquium series inviting some very remarkable people, but also conferences. Later this week, I will be hosting what I think is a wonderful conference entitled The Good Samaritan in the Global Age, and subtitled Migration, Religion, and the World Economy. I left some flyers here. If you're interested, our opening session, which is open to the public, will take place this Thursday at 4:30 p.m. And it is called Open or Closed Borders, ? Moral and Practical Questions. The keynote speaker will be a remarkable individual, Rick Uford Chase, who is the founder of Borderlinks. I don't know whether you have heard about Borderlinks. It's an organization that has been catering and advocating for humane treatment and rights on behalf of illegal immigrants, how cool, who are trying to cross the Arizona desert into the United States. But in order to show that I am not totally inflexible, educationally speaking, the respondent will be Peter Meilander, who takes precisely the opposite position. The moderator will be our own Robert Woodnow, who is the chair of the Department of Sociology and just an extraordinary scholar, probably the most important sociologist on religion and immigration on the planet at this time. So 4:30 Thursday, McCormick 101, that's where the museum is located. And if you're interested, I've left some flyers here for your consumption. Mexico, the biggest city. I would like to restrain my remarks to about 35 minutes in order to entertain your questions that I have heard will be of the highest quality, or at least that has been Mark's impression throughout this lecture series. I've divided my presentation into three parts. The first one is just consists of a few remarks to remind all of us about the origins of Mexico City. And here, as I discuss this with you, what I would like to emphasize is a point that I often make for the benefit of my students, and that is that cities are not inevitable. The oldest cities that we know date back to about between 5,000 and 1,500 years before Christ. And the oldest one, although archaeologists keep on changing their mind, is the city of Ur. Cities existed in antiquity. Cities were very important in the Roman Empire. But cities, ladies and gentlemen, disappeared in Europe during the Middle Ages as a result of the blocking of the Mediterranean on the part of Muslim civilization. And so what we generally think of as that romantic period of feudalism and the Middle Ages is really about the ruralization of Europe, about the time, that period during which cities in Europe were almost completely vacated, and even people with power and authority repaired to the countryside. Money also disappeared. Markets, in fact, disappeared. All these are contingent things. And so one of the points that I'm going to stress here is that Mexico City is a city that reflects social, economic, and political processes. And although it is somewhat entertaining to look at the superficial material aspects of Mexico City, what's most interesting is to look at what those material structures, the streets, the concentration of particular populations in certain neighborhoods, the building of modern structures upon the legacy of the pre-Hispanic and colonial period. All these are elements that express economic, political, and social processes. I grew up in Mexico City, and I came of age and began my studies precisely in that city. So that what I want to bring to your attention is not the touristic version of Mexico City, but the sociological and economic perspective on Mexico City. Let's look a little bit about the origins. European cities, I tell my students, that is modern cities that reemerge around the 13th century, precisely after the Middle Ages, were cities that were foci of investment. The story is long and entertaining, but what we see now in Europe, cities like Paris, Barcelona, certainly Florence, which is one of my favorites, bespeaks and suggests a situation in which the founders of the cities, who by the way were the outsiders of the feudal system, they were the travelers, the expeditioners, the bankers, in other words, the founders of the modern capitalist system. And those folks believed in themselves. They gave us a legacy of individualism, of genius, of intellectual achievement that had been much diminished under the Catholic theocracy that preceded it during the Middle Ages. They saw the cities, the word burg, including, which is also the word from which such quaint terms as borough and burg, and burgo in Spanish derive, means fortified city. And so the modern city in Europe really emerges as a place of refuge for those who were not in compliance with the economic and political rules of the Middle Ages. Those folks like, I'm sure you know the names of the Gattamelata, the Medici, the Borgia, the great families of the Renaissance, invested all that they had upon the cities that had given them hospitality and nurtured what one great historian calls the new merchant class. And I draw your attention to the characteristics of those cities for several reasons. First of all, you may have noticed that in European cities, life really begins around 10 p.m. Many of you have traveled to those cities, for example, Barcelona, etc. It would never occur under normal circumstances to European cosmopolitans to leave the downtown area in order to live in the suburbs. Actually, America is about the only country that I know of that abandons its cities. But footnote, that has to do with the race question. I cannot address it right now. The idea of suburbanization in order to escape the black menace is an innately American idea. But in Europe, that never happens or hasn't happened until recently. We are experiencing times of change. All the contrary is true, and that is that in European cities, life and action occur precisely in the downtown areas, which have been infused by the oxygen of investment for many generations. Flash laterally, actually, to the colonial city in Latin America, of which Mexico City is the true exemplar. The Latin American city comes into modernity, that is, into a period of capitalist expansion, precisely as a so-called discovery of America. It is very important to remember that Christopher Columbus' travels were not just travels propelled by an interest in discovery. Those travels were part and parcel of a very rugged competition among hegemonic powers in Europe, particularly Portugal and Spain, who were already trying to gain the upper hand upon one another in what was in which were the early stages of modern capitalism. But by contrast to the European city, the colonial city emerges not as a place for investment, but as an administrative center whose purpose is to channel the wealth from a vast countryside to the motherland in Europe. And so let's take the example of Mexico City. Mexico City rises atop the ruins of the great Tenochtitlan. I'm sure that you have heard that, and I realize that I think that about at least half or more of those present here have been to Mexico City, so I'm sure that you have visited the greatest museum in the world, or so we claim, and that would be the Museo Nacional de Antropología y Historia, the Anthropology Museum on Reforma Avenue, where you can see many of the amazing sculptures and pieces, works of art produced in pre-Hispanic times. And of course you know about the Aztecs, brutal people that they were, who had created nonetheless an extraordinary civilization in the central part of Mexico's plateau. It was a civilization that was created in the middle of a swamp. Much of the areas underneath the city are still swampish. They created a sort of Venice. But it was an empire that was as brutal as any other empire. Human sacrifice was frequent, and human sacrifice was not just a quaint cultural tradition. It was an attempt at imposing order upon a large population distributed throughout what is now Mexico. When the Spanish conquerors arrived in the Great Tenochtitlan, perhaps you've also heard about this, they were astonished by the beauty of the architecture and the sophistication of a civilization. Consider this only. You have a mental map of Mexico, which looks, or so we were told when we were children, in that country it looks like an inverted horn of abundance. And the Gulf Coast, which you probably remember, connects us with the ocean, was in fact linked to what is now Mexico City by individuals who would actually place live fish in large gourds and bring them to the home of the Aztec emperor through relay races. So that in less than 24 hours it was possible, or about 24 hours it was possible, to get live fish, fresh fish, to the table of the emperor. The ceramic produced by this civilization has been found as far as southern United States. It was a great culture, and Bernal Díaz del Castillo, the soldier that accompanied Hernán Cortés as he approached the Great Tenochtitlan, writes extensively about the beauty of the architecture and the extensive size of the city and the largeness of the population. So it was that city, the center of the Aztec Empire, that had to be colonized, because that's what colonials do. And it is atop that city that the New Spain was formed. The New Spain was basically the center of control of the Spanish crown over the territories that it had conquered. The only point that I want to make for you right now is that during that period you have a constant funneling of wealth, mostly from the agricultural areas onto the motherland. And this should make us understand a couple of other things that are so important that most people do not give enough attention to. And that is that from its inception, Mexico City and Mexico, the country, were dependent upon the larger world economy. Now, why is that important? It is important because the history of Mexico and other Latin American countries is one of subordination in the larger international economy. What does that exactly mean? It means that Mexico and other Latin American countries have never had control over their own resources. Let's draw a comparison, shall we? The United States becomes a great manufacturing country during the latter part of the 19th century. And it comes as a rude shock and surprise to many to learn that one of the things that worked very well for the American economy was in the fact that it did not have to compete with other nations in terms of production, so that its large capital goods industry, from which we're still deriving benefits, was expanded under highly protectionist barriers, and also as a result of the importation of immigrant labor from various parts in Europe. Protectionism may not work, and most Americans feel very strongly against protectionist measures, but I would like you to know that it does work, or did work, at least in this country. It certainly does not work in Latin American countries because those countries were from the beginning incorporated into the world economy in a highly subordinate manner. By subordination, I mean what I said before, and that is that they never had control over their own wealth. The colonial period lasted 300 years and left us something that is absolutely magnificent, or at least it was magnificent to me. I wish I could share more of this with you, and that is extraordinary architecture and works of art throughout Mexico City, from the 16th to the 19th century, including the very remarkable cathedral, which still stands in swampy land in downtown Mexico. In 1821, Mexico acquired independence from Spain, and its modern period begins, a period that is characterized by what scholars generally know as distorted industrialization. In other words, again, different powers, England as well as Spain, and very soon the United States, began to draw resources and turned Mexico very much, not turned, but continued the history of Mexico as an export-oriented economy. Now, why is this important to a city like Mexico, and I'm going to show you a few slides in a moment. It's important because, think about it, in countries where there's no proper investment, and in cities, in countries like Mexico where there's no proper investment, and where the administrative center of political control is located in a particular place, the result is very simple and always predictable, and that is that the only action going on is in places like Mexico City. And so throughout the colonial period and through the 19th century to the present, until fairly recently, what you have is a constant stream of people from the countryside migrating into a city like Mexico City. Now, why should that matter? Well, it matters because what it creates is the biggest city in the world. That is a huge concentration of people seeking for economic opportunity. But in a city like Mexico City, the supply of jobs has never been sufficient to meet the demand. And there have not been other cities until fairly recently which can absorb the kinds of population that migrates from rural centers to the cities in search of employment. What is the result? The result is multidimensional. The result, for example, is the creation of a vast informal economy. And I'm sure you're not among them because you're highly sophisticated and knowledgeable, but how frustrating it is to hear people say, well, you know, I visit the city and it's like kind of polluted. The food was okay, a little hot, but it was okay. But you know, so many people on the street selling things, it's like appalling. Well, I don't understand that kind of mentality, except that there are many American visitors who kind of like think about travel as transporting themselves in a bubble. So you go from the bubble in Princeton to a bubble in Cancun or in Mexico City. Well, the idea is to look at some of the exotic visions of the third world, but in a safe place. Now, you are not among them. However, it is very important, I think, and I think we will be doing a great service to humanity if next time that you travel, you really interrogate the processes, such as the ones that I am describing, that have given rise to this. I personally always found street vendors quite extraordinarily attractive, but some people don't. Well, those street vendors are people who are part of the informal economy. In other words, they are people who came from the countryside, arrived in Mexico City, and were not able to obtain jobs in the formal economy. Let me define the terms. Formal economy is that which is supervised by the authorities, by government authorities. People pay taxes, people pay minimum wages, there is some protection of the interests of workers, and so on and so forth. In other words, there is some level of regulation that protects both employers and workers, but there are just not enough of those employers to provide such protections to workers. And so the result is the proliferation of small businesses and workers and homes in which all kinds of goods and services are produced, but without regulation. In fact, you may be interested in knowing about one of my favorite examples of the informal economy, because I think that some of you have seen them. You have seen indigenous groups dancing in the streets of Mexico. In fact, there are some who dance in front of the Museum of Anthropology. And most observers look at these groups imagining that these dancers with the shells around their ankles and the feathers in their wonderful headdresses, blowing through flutes and producing magnificent music, are the heirs and descendants of indigenous people in Mexico. Well, they're not. They are urban proletarians who have learned that tourists are interested in Mexico's indigenous past. And so in accordance to the research conducted, for example, by one of my favorite anthropologists, Lourdes Arizpe, these inventive and creative people who come from the countryside have learned to reproduce the native outfits and demeanor of indigenous people in order to capitalize on the desire and expectations of tourists. This is not a bad thing. It does suggest how creative and multifaceted the informal economy can be. And in a country with the extraordinary artistic legacy of Mexico, it does not surprise that art is part of that informal urban economy. But my point, ladies and gentlemen, is that indigenous dancers in Mexico City are really an urban product. They're the product of the biggest city in the world, and a byproduct of the insufficient capacity of industry and the formal economy to absorb the supply of labor. It is precisely that which leads us to the thorny subject of not just rural-urban migration, but international migration. Most Mexicans who live in Mexico City are not migrating to the United States, but many Mexicans are migrating to this country. And I understand that Douglas Massey was here discussing that subject, so I cannot say much other than to remind you that migration to the United States is not just the result of demand, of supply. In other words, it's not just that Mexican workers are interested in exploring other avenues for opportunity, is that demand exists in the United States. And why wouldn't it exist? Because after all, we do share 2,000 miles of borderlands. We have a history of profound economic and political interdependence. And as I'm sure Doug mentioned, we have the North American Free Trade Agreement, which, have you ever considered what it is to utter the words free trade? Free trade. So why is it that the Free Trade Agreement is about 3,000 pages long? It is not exactly about free trade, it's about controlled trade, but the North American Free Trade Agreement seeks to dismantle many of the barriers that have interfered with the free movement of international investments. It was, however, completely disingenuous or naive to imagine that the passage of NAFTA would be able to liberalize all markets except one, and that is workers, labor. So that at this day, we are observing many Mexicans attempting to cross the border. In fact, about 300 of them that we know died attempting to cross the Arizona desert. And that, on a yearly basis, is more than all people, I understand, who tried to cross into West Germany during the time that the wall was established. So it's not becoming to a country like ours to have such a limited immigration policy. But I wanted to show you, because I think they're beautiful and also illustrative, so let me show you a few slides which really illustrate a phenomenon that is known as populism, which is a phenomenon very much about the city, and which will allow me to illustrate the similar issues that have to do with Mexico City. The term populist or populism is used to designate narratives that represent the people in, as part of a larger strategy on the part of state authorities to make visible and or mobilize workers and the poor, and that becomes extremely important in Latin American context because the human and material resources do not exist in order to cater to all the needs of the population. Some of you perhaps know about the Argentinian example. You all, I hope, have seen Evita, one of my favorite movies. And we'll remember Evita Perón as an individual who understood and identified with her people. The populations loved her, and as a result accepted conditions that were somewhat inferior to those that they would have expected under normal conditions. So populism becomes this narrative that emerges under conditions where state authorities do not have the material and human resources in order to cater to all the needs of people. But in Mexico, populism gave also rise to an extraordinary artistic movement that is generally known as muralism. What you're observing on your screen is the dome of the Hospicio Cabañas in Guadalajara from 1939. This is José Clemente Orozco, who is the Michelangelo of the Americas, representing a triumph, it's called Man of Fire, and it's a representation of a triumphant humanity over adversity and struggle. You've heard about Frida Kahlo, who's been now made famous by one of my favorite people at present, and that would be Salma Hayek, who also gave us Ugly Betty, yes, and who has acquired considerable prominence in recent times. The reason why I show you this one is because of the glorification of the indigenous attire, which of course was seen by people of my own class background in Mexico City as repugnant, you see, because the dominant classes in Mexico City always looked at the indigenous population with some contempt, so that muralism, as part of this populist trend that sustained, in fact, the official party, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, for 70 years, was based upon making visible many of the indigenous elements that had been obliterated by dominant classes, always too interested in Europe and then the United States. But how about this one by another great Mexican mural painter? This one is called The Devil Inside the Church, and it's from the early 1940s. It's one of my favorite paintings. Siqueiros, David Alfaro Siqueiros, was interested in melding various art forms, and so his work often looks sculptural and even architectural, as I'll show you in a second. But this is a representation, as you can see, and now I get to use the magnificent pointer. As you can see, here is the population. They're all wearing kind of the typical peasant outfit. Their arms extended to heaven. This is a vitriolic criticism of the Catholic Church that was so highly instrumental in colonization. The building is a 16th century church, and the ruling class is right here in the upper part, dressed in its finery, with the devil presiding over the whole thing. It is a didactic kind of representation of American society for the benefit of the people, the term that is associated with populism. You can imagine in a country in which the vast majority of people are Catholic, this constituted more than a critique of the existing conditions. But populism also brings about, this is a profoundly urban movement. These were not works of art that emerged in the smaller cities of Mexico or that were produced by indigenous or peasant populations. These were cosmopolitans who became what Antonio Gramsci would call the organic intellectuals of the Mexican state. And by the Mexican state, I'm referring particularly to those founders of the institutional revolutionary party. And by the way, the very term Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI, that governed Mexico successfully for about 70 years, is a true representation of populism, can you see? Because it's about institutionalizing the revolution in true oxymoron. But the idea was to incorporate all the various sectors of Mexican society, including workers and peasants, in the name of a single and unified nation that had had a glorious pre-Hispanic past and that had not been destroyed by colonial domination. This is a representation of Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, who was the leader of Mexico's independence movement. And this is one of my favorite, this is a painting by Orozco that is just extraordinary, and it alludes to the Mexican Revolution of 1910, which you may remember was the first revolution, populist revolution of the 20th century, 7 years before the Russian Revolution. Again, a glorification of the suffering of the popular classes. Yet again, this is Diego Rivera, and you're probably not interested in this, but let me say that this particular horse is one of the most beautiful I don't say it, people kind of agree that this is one of the most interesting representations of a horse in the, internationally speaking, in the art of the 20th century. And the representation is that of Emiliano Zapata, who was the founder of the Ejido movement and struggled in order to have the land redistributed appropriately among Mexicans. Very quickly, I will just bring you to the present. Look at this by Diego Rivera. It's a glorification, this is taken from a book because that's the only thing I could do. But it's kind of interesting because this is the famous Tianquisli, which some of you may have seen in the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, that is equivalent to the Greek agora. It was the marketplace where people exchanged not just products in large scale in a very sophisticated manner, but also information and the rule of law. This one, which is called La Dictadura, the dictatorship, represents the ruling classes of Mexico by Diego Rivera, including the chieftains of the political structure, the caciques, those would be more of the rural rulers, the military represented as a hawk, and somewhere in the background you will see the face of so this is kind of like the dictators and smaller chieftains, and the military represented as a pig, and somewhere in the back the Catholic Church observing and conspiring with this kind of oppressive and a structure of domination. But populism is also about exaltation of the countryside. This is a very famous painting by Diego Rivera, which is in one of the agricultural schools, because one of the legacies of the revolution that was also perpetuated through the center, which was Mexico City, was a glorification of the countryside. This is a representation, by the way, this is a representation of a pregnant earth, but more interestingly, from the point of view of gossip, it is a portrayal of Tina Modotti, who was an Italian political activist and photographer, and also Diego Rivera's mistress. He had many lovers. And finally, I want to show you just 3 slides. This is what we know as the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, the Plaza of the Three Cultures. It's an extraordinary, it was constructed by several architects and urban planners, but the idea here, also a populist idea, was to bring together the 3 stages in the development of the city. I'm sure that some of you have been there. So as you can see here, we are observing the ruins of pre-Hispanic structures that were destroyed by the Spaniards in order to construct. So here you have some of the foundations of pre-Hispanic pyramids that were deliberately destroyed in order to, and the stones used in order to build 16th century churches like this one. Can there be a more obvious statement about destruction and reconstruction in the name of colonial power? And then in the background, the modern residential complexes produced in the 50s and 60s by the revolutionary state. Can you see the message? In a profoundly urban setting like Mexico City, you have this glorification of a history that involves conquest but also resurrection during the modern period. And in this again, it was artists like the 3 famous mural painters, Rivera, Siqueiros, and Orozco, that produced important visual images in order to support those kinds of ideological conceptions. This is one of the hospitals in the city, also covered with extraordinary mosaic, all of which can be seen by the people. And so the expectation, and by the way, that was also true about the very Museum of Anthropology. I mean, those of you who have been there, it was not just a museum, it was a statement and an affirmation about the capacity of Mexico to overcome all kinds of difficulties and problems. And finally, this is subsidized a residential housing complex built also under the aegis of the PRI. And so it brings to your attention the idea that Mexico City is not just a city that belongs in the memory of people who have seen better things, but a city that is constantly resurrecting and developing into a more modern and more thriving environment. Yes, it is about the biggest city in the world. I'm almost done with this. At the central part of Mexico, there are, at present, I just checked the figures, about between 8 million and 9 million people. But if you count the adjoining areas, which often were formed precisely by those rural urban migrants who arrived in the city seeking for opportunity, the number of residents rises to about 11 million people. It is or 12 million people. It's a very large concentration of population. Let me conclude with several ideas that I think are important. Mexico is not an impoverished country. This may come as a very big surprise to some of you. But in fact, Mexico is the 13th economy in the world. And international lending organizations think of Mexico as a middle-class country. It is certainly one of the fastest growing economies. It just reached $1 trillion level. And so poverty is not exactly the major problem of the country. Inequality is. Inequality that creates all kinds of difficulties throughout the 20th century. The other problem that Mexico, the country, and Mexico, the city have is its high level of dependency upon external economic interests. And in recent times, the most important exponent of this trend has been precisely in the form of neoliberalism, an economic trend that maintains the significance of free markets, but which in fact is about, as I said earlier, with respect to the North American Free Trade Agreement, more about control markets for populations that have an international provenance. And so the urban space that we see in a slide like this one is shaped not accidentally or neutrally. When you see the distribution of population, say for example, low-income populations in the city, you are also observing, although you may not be aware of this, a relationship between the country in the larger world economy, but also a relationship between the state authorities and the people who are seeking opportunity. So for example, squatter settlements, which also always fascinated me, of which there are many in Mexico City, are really the visible manifestation of a symbiotic relationship between state authorities and workers. A country like Mexico has a state that is large and cumbersome, but also lacking in human and material resources. The general pattern in a city like this one has been for workers to arrive and occupy private spaces. The state often has tolerated those kinds of occupations, even at the expense of private rights. Workers then, slowly but surely, start building their own homes. Have you seen them in the barrios, in the ciudades perdidas, the lost cities? Many of them, particularly the men, work in construction sites. They take some of the construction materials and start building the homes. If you go to Mexico City, especially the periphery, that explains why you see so many unfinished homes. They are being built not by construction companies, but by the owners themselves. And eventually, they produce grassroots organizations and some kind of social order so that the state then arrives and brings in some services. But you know what that means. It means that the people who have been allowed to live in squatter settlements and who have produced their own means of survival, including shelter, and who then see the state bringing in services, will also be happy to vote for particular patrons whom they have among state authorities. And so squatter settlements are not just shanty towns populated by poor people. A lot of vitality exists there, and the squatter settlements themselves express a particularly interesting relationship with state authorities. One final word on the North American Free Trade Agreement, because in recent times, and that is since 1994, the effect of NAFTA has been to further exacerbate some of these inequalities. NAFTA has been fantastic, and neoliberal economic policies have been in general very, very successful in promoting the property rights and well-being of people like us. My students at Princeton University now have more in common with young people who are educated and affluent anywhere in the world than they have with respect to members of their own nation who are poor or racialized or excluded. And the same thing is true in Mexico. So that thanks to rapid communications and the marvelous internet, as well as some of these policies of liberalization, there have been many winners. The winners are educated, affluent people for whom property rights are being maintained. But the real problem in a city like this one, which over the last 10 to 15 years has experienced things that I never witnessed during the time that I was growing up in it, including kidnappings, assaults, a constant exacerbation of the problems, not of poverty, but of inequality perpetuated by some of these economic policies. I want to stop right there in order to have enough time to entertain your questions. I would only like to say then that a city like Mexico City right now is really at the crossroads. On the one hand, it has all that is excellent about modernity, about globalization, about the benefits that accrue from liberalized markets. But a Mexican city like Mexico City also has the worst of all possible worlds, and that is a growing population whose desires are very much the same as those of affluent people, but for whom there are not sufficient means to achieve those ends. And we know from sociological research that when there is a disjuncture or a lack of correspondence between means and ends, something strange happens. People do not change their values or their desires. They just find other ways to achieve them. And those ways generally have to do with things like crime or exclusion or disaffection or rejection of mainstream norms and values. And so we don't know what will happen in the future to a city like Mexico City, but one thing we do know, and that is whatever happens there is emblematic of other processes that are taking place in other parts of the world. You've been wonderful, and I appreciate your attention. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll be delighted to answer them. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
The picture that you just showed,
Which we just lost. That's a subsidized residential complex in Nonualco, Mexico, which is very much in one of the areas in Mexico City.
but the part that was interesting to me was it appeared to show you had many, many houses, but if you looked at the road, there weren't cars that corresponded to the numbers of houses that were there.
Well, that's right. And if you have been in Mexico City, you also, I mean, this was not at all the case while I was growing up there, but the level of traffic congestion and pollution are great. This is not slander. Now, but this is not about, I guess, let me see whether I can put it even more clearly. It's not just that the local authorities or the federal government are inefficient. As a matter of fact, this proved to be an extraordinarily effective government. It's because of the character of the development, of the urban development process. When you have such large concentrations of people and insufficient resources, then what you get are some of the problems of underdevelopment, including pollution, traffic congestion, street vendors, and so on and so forth. Right? Do we have other, sir?
Would you say a word about the industries that have grown up just south of the border in Mexico?
Well, I am so glad you asked. And God knows I really did not pay you anything, did I? Because that's what my research is all about. I was actually one of the first people who produced an ethnography on globalization. In 1978 and 1979, I was actually conducting my my dissertation research in Ciudad Juarez, which is immediately across from El Paso, Texas. And I don't know whether you're acquainted with this quaint academic ritual, but anthropologists are required and eager to do what we call participant observations. I thought, although I had studied art history, it was mentioned earlier on, I just found the idea of export processing zones flourishing across the border to be a fantastic subject for a dissertation, because here you had two contiguous countries, one described as underdeveloped, the other one the largest economic power in the world, separated by a thin line that was also very long, 2,000 miles long. And in 1965, Mexico had inaugurated what was then known as the Maquiladora program. Maquiladora is a word that is now used extensively throughout the world to designate the directly owned subsidiaries or subcontracted plants connected to companies generally in the United States. So this is one of the most important manifestations of globalization. And that is to have American companies that have been constantly relocating assembly operations to Asia and to the U.S.-Mexico border. So that you have two sides to this story. On the one hand, throughout the 1970s and 80s, American companies relocated assembly to Asia and the U.S.-Mexico border, also to the Caribbean, in massive ways. Millions of manufacturing jobs were lost in the United States in what is euphemistically known as a transition from a manufacturing to a services or information-based economy. The counterpart is the emergence of these export processing zones in places like Mexico. What I was doing was working as a seamstress in a Mexican maquiladora as part of the research because, hey, what else was there to do, right? As a seamstress for a company, for an assembly plant that produced shirts for such well-known American companies as Sears Roebuck, Billy the Kid, Devon, and so on and so forth. The idea was, they were then called twin plants, and the idea was to actually just move the assembly to the Mexican side in order to take advantage of the large wage differential. So that in 1978, 79, I was earning about 59 cents an hour. The equivalent minimum wage in El Paso, Texas, which is in one of the most depressed areas of the United States, was about 9 times larger. You see? And so you're quite right, and I'm very grateful that you asked that question, because you really cannot understand Mexico City without understanding that in recent times, precisely as a result of this process of globalization, there have been many other cities, particularly on the border, that have been growing rapidly because of the availability of these new jobs, which are export-oriented jobs, you see? And so many people now migrate to places like Ciudad Juarez, which is growing very rapidly. But that's not necessarily good news for several reasons. And if you have additional questions about this is a subject that is dear to my heart. In 1983, I published a book called For We Are Sold, I and My People. It's a statement from the Book of Esther, and subtitled Women in Industry in Mexico's Frontier. Most of the workers in those export-oriented plants at the time were women. The gender ratio has changed somewhat, but not the vulnerability of those workers. And as part of that project, that book, it's not necessarily with pride that I say that that book, which has not been revised to this day because I have never found the time, continues to be has never gone out of print. As part of that project, and I'd love to bring this to your attention, maybe at some point in time you'd be interested in it, I co-produced a documentary entitled The Global Assembly Plant, which received an Emmy from the American Academy of Television Arts and Sciences in 1987. And that film was actually filmed in the Philippines, in Mexico, along the border, and in the United States. It is about the effects of these processes of globalization, that is relocation of manufacturing operations from countries like the United States to places like Ciudad Juarez along the border. Now, is this good or bad? Well, it depends on where you are in the pecking order, because you see, the most important thing to understand about these processes of globalization is that increasingly they decouple production from consumption, if you will. In other words, think, just for a moment, think 1937, General Motors, Flint, Michigan. Are you there? Because 1937 was the year in which the workers in Flint, Michigan actually went on a sit-in strike. Now, I know that most of you are not real fans of strikes, but strikes had a function because those workers who were local workers in Flint, Michigan were able to bring General Motors, at that time the largest corporation in the world, but also the largest employer of workers in the United States to the bargaining table. You see, it was as a result of that that workers in this country obtained benefits, obtained better returns, better working conditions, better salaries, wages, you see. At present, General Motors is still the largest corporation in the world, but it's no longer the largest employer of people in the United States. You see. Instead, General Motors has all kinds of plants throughout the world where the workers are not necessarily regarded as one of the reasons why the 1937 strike was so successful, it lasted 42 days, it was a great strike. And you know why? Because it was not like anarchist or, a Marxist or communist movement. It was a genuinely American movement of workers who just wanted to have a piece of the American dream. And it was about negotiation. It was not about, Pinkertons bashing heads or any of those kinds of things. And it really produced a very vital and important labor movement in this country. It really was part of the American dream. But one of the reasons why that happened was twofold. First of all, General Motors had to negotiate with those workers because it could not move jobs to Asia or to the U.S.-Mexico border. In other words, there was a much higher level of interdependence between normal American working people and corporations. And the second one was, and this was, of course, the genius of Henry Ford, who had invented the 5-hour day, right? And that was to understand that workers at the local level in the United States were consumers also, and that you really could not create or improve aggregate demand without improving the consumption capacity of workers. Now, flash forward to the present and think Shenzhen in southern China or Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. You don't have to look at those workers as consumers of your products, is it? And as I have done a huge number of interviews with managers and workers in Mexico, in Ciudad Juarez, I can tell you that the managers understand this perfectly, that if they have any kind of disruption, it's impossible to go on a sit-in strike. And some people might think that this is really very good. But the problem is that it's also impossible to improve the wages of workers. In the year 2001, I actually took several entrepreneurial undergraduates to Ciudad Juarez to revisit the location where I had done the research, and we had the opportunity to interview prominent members of the American Chamber, of the El Paso Chamber of Commerce. And one of the questions that we asked is, do wages have to be that small? Because, by the way, did I mention wages are actually smaller now in Ciudad Juarez than the ones that I was earning in 1978, you see? There's not been an increase in wages. There has been a decrease in the value of the wage. And this gentleman, charming gentleman, I've interviewed so many of these charming gentlemen, steely-eyed. So I'm not getting this information, ladies and gentlemen, from the workers. I'm getting this information from a representative of the El Paso Chamber of Commerce. And the answer is, we pay those wages because we can. In other words, there are no political obstructions to lower the wages as much as possible. And what are the other effects of this? This liberalization of markets. Well, I don't know whether you have read, but Ciudad Juarez is notorious for the number of young women who are mutilated and killed every year and then dumped into the desert across or in the border, along the border. Now, who is responsible for these murders? Many of them are workers in these plants. We are all responsible in a collective sense because, you see, the city is growing extremely fast. There are no resources there. There's no investment in order to produce streets or residential complexes. The young women often live in areas that are not paved and that do not have enough lighting. It's like Princeton, but not really. They work in factories. There's no proper transportation. They work long shifts and often have to use public transportation to places that are not close to their homes, so that they have to walk in the dark. And if that were not enough, The society, that is the prominent people of Ciudad Juarez, often see those young women with suspicion as possible prostitutes because, A, they're young and they wear miniskirts. You know? So that it's horrifying to see, for example, journalistic reports about these horrendous murders in Ciudad Juarez, blaming the young women. The young women who are actually living in these squatter settlements of a fastly growing city as a result of the maquiladora. And it's not that I'm blaming the maquiladores, please understand. I'm saying there you have a truly biblical scene. Convergence of all possible evils, you see? Irresponsible entrepreneurs who think that providing adequate transportation would be, excuse me, tantamount to socialism, right? Irresponsible authorities without the means, let alone the political will, to actually put some restraints and some investment into providing proper transportation, arteries, lighting, and a society not so different from ours that is so comfortable in passing judgment upon the vulnerable. So that's part of what's happening. And what's happening in China, in Shenzhen, is not very different and probably worse in terms of the working conditions. So that you have, it's not that globalization is bad, it's that globalization is creating very different rules in terms of the relationship between investors and workers. Yes, ma'am?
We always hear about the Mexican immigrants coming into America, but I recently read about Mexico having that problem from the country south of them trying to get into Mexico to get jobs. Can you talk about the immigrant situation?
Well, I think that's what I just did for the past
No, but you were talking
40 minutes.
north. I'm talking
No. Before that, you'll remember that I was describing, in fact, I described rural-urban migration, which has been,
But you were talking, I thought that was in Mexico. I'm talking people who are illegal trying to get into Mexico.
oh, you mean from Guatemala?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, yes, you see, let me put this in perspective. Less than 2% of the world population ever migrates across international borders. So you might not really be aware of this if you're in New York City, but it isn't really the case that most people are trying to crash into our country or into countries that offer better opportunities than those that can be found in their places of birth. It's not exactly like that. Nevertheless, having said that, international migration it involves a very substantial number of people, both in South America and in Mexico. The case of the Guatemalans is particularly tragic in every way. And by the way, here in Princeton, we have a very large Guatemalan community. That's our largest immigrant group. And most of those folks are here illegally in Princeton, in the Witherspoon's Jackson neighborhood. But it's particularly tragic because those are people who originally left their country escaping a 12-year-long civil war, which also had significant genocidal aspect to it. And they came into the United States seeking protection, but because they didn't have the political clout or the numbers, and see, that's the reason how our government actually knew where they were, because they actually entered the country seeking protection, so they became part of the system. I'm coming to that in a moment. And so now they are being deported from this country. Mexico is also deporting them. And there are large refugee areas in the southern part of Mexico where many Guatemalans are concentrated. So if with your question you're saying, well, Mexico is doing the same thing that the United States is doing, you're right, but that doesn't make it right.
That's a part that you don't hear very much about.
Well, ma'am, let me say that you generally don't hear much about Latin America in this country anyway. And most of what you hear is whether a bus kind of fell off the Andes or whether there was so there is very little knowledge, I'm sure you're aware, we do have in the United States a short historical memory and very, very little information about countries south of the border. So the answer is yes, there are those refugee centers. You don't hear much about them, but frankly, you don't hear much about nothing south of the border. Uh, are there other questions? Yes, back there?
Well, what you described, the working conditions and the lack of any recourse for strike, what do you see it building up pressure and maybe something in the future?
You know, I couldn't hear that last part.
With the fact that the workers in these countries don't have any recourse now to strike or for any sort of participation in what they're doing, what do you see as what's going to happen as the pressures keep building on it and it makes it worse and worse?
It's an interesting question because, but the answer is not obvious. The anti-globalization movements, which started looking as if they were on the ascent prior to the 9/11 catastrophe, were complicated and disturbing because they gathered together people from very different political and ideological perspectives. I am not sure that the anti-globalization movement has been very effective. And furthermore, I don't see globalization as necessarily an evil trend. The problem is about the differential effects on different segments of the population. You're right, the traditional means for obtaining redress for grievances, like the strike, labor unions, etc., are not being very effective. Maquiladoras, for example, going back to the gentleman's question, cannot be unionized. I mean, managers used to tell me, well, we like unions sometimes, you know, because we see them as management instruments. We have a large number of people working for us. We'd like to deal with them through the unions. So the unions became very much part and parcel of the management process. Strikes, we actually, in the documentary that I mentioned before, we captured a strike that had very, very limited success. So those traditional, in the United States, as you probably know, our unionization rate is now perilously hovering around 10%. It once was about 33%, and that was not a huge number of people either, I mean, proportionally speaking. But we don't know what the future will bring about. We know that the same kinds of alternatives and routes that have been opened up, say, for example, by transnational investments, are being used by what would appear to be very vulnerable workers in the pursuit of their own interests, including those who are now here illegally. And part of what they're doing is refusing to abide by the rules of the modern world system. I cannot answer your question comfortably. All that I can say is that we're not in a position to know what new alternatives for mobilization will be created in the future. And I always tell my students, you know, if you had been living in this country in 1953, you would not have imagined what came only a few years later, the civil rights movement. So there are all kinds of surprises that we can expect in the future, but none of them, but there's no obvious thing that we can predict at present. As I said, and want to reiterate at present, at this time, it's not like I mean, think for example about, I define globalization as relocation of manufacturing, but globalization has also been about cheaper and faster transportation, the internet, all kinds of new technology that potentially can be very, very useful to humble workers attempting to improve their working conditions. Right. Yes, sir. Or ma'am.
I'm sorry, excuse me, but do you think that the teachers' strike in Oaxaca, which developed into a much broader protest movement, was an aberration in terms of the political sensitivity
No, I don't think it was an aberration at all. I think that there are all kinds of opportunities for those kinds of popular mobilizations. You're probably acquainted with the Zapatista movement that occurred precisely even as the North American Free Trade Agreement was being passed. Many people saw it as a reaction against globalization, but further research showed that that's not what was happening. Generally, you see, one of the great secrets of the PRI, which of course I didn't have time to discuss extensively, but it was an extraordinary phenomenon, because imagine a country with that kind of history and those kinds of problems. The PRI is founded in 1929, and it was successful in ruling peacefully and without too much abuse of, or violence for about 70 years. How did it do it? It did it by incorporating all sectors of Mexican society and providing them with a certain modicum of power. For a long times, including the period that I was growing up in Mexico, people used to wonder about why it was that every 6 years, when a new president was nominated by the PRI, so all you had to know in Mexico City, in Mexico, was who the candidate of the PRI was. Then you knew who the next president would be, you see. But once the person was nominated, that person would go and engage himself in what appeared to be a furious and totalizing campaign. Graffiti, political graffiti on the walls, speeches, the candidate traveling to the most remote parts of Mexico. Why? Well, not because there was any uncertainty that he was going to be the next president, but because he was making contact with every group and promising particular favors, or at least inclusion in the political apparatus. And this happened for most of the existence of the PRI until fairly recently, when some of our political technocrats started violating the rules and wanted to take more power. Part of what happened with the Zapatistas, and what I'm pretty sure happened in Oaxaca, is that people were excluded from this large system of patronage, which is not very modern, but which has worked so well for such a long period of time, in the sense that it has maintained control and peace in the country. And as you have noticed, the country is not as peaceful as it was a few years ago. Part of the reason is that the structure of the political machinery is changing rather dramatically. So it's not an aberration.
Another question, please.
Thank you.
Remember,